about. This is a text that I have both learned and taught in a variety of contexts before, and I think is one of, in my view, I have not learned every single piece of this book, but from the little bit that I have learned, this is one of the most compelling, to me, texts in the entire book. So the Piaseczna Rebbe was the rabbi of a town in Poland called Piaseczno, or Piaseczna, depends on how you transliterate it. One of the challenges, of course, with a lot of these rebbes and rabbis is that the way that we anglicize or Hebraicize, depending on where you are, the spellings of the Polish names of towns they came from can often shift how we refer to the person. I generally use the term the Piaseczna Rebbe, and so he was the grand rabbi or the Rebbe of a town called Piaseczna in Poland, and he was very interested in educational pedagogy as well as thinking about ways to strengthen Jewish culture at a time when secularization between World War I and World War II, secularization was really prominent in Polish Jewry, as well as other Jewish movements that were not necessarily religious. So he was very committed to strengthening Jewish spirituality, really educating people in a holistic way. And he has a variety of books that talk about educational theories as well as about spiritual growth. And the book that we're going to be learning from today is called the Aish Kodesh, it was published under that name in Israel in 1950. And it's actually a compilation of Divrei Torah, of commentaries on the weekly Parsha that the Piaseczna Rebbe wrote himself while he was interned in the Warsaw Ghetto, which began immediately after the Nazis invaded Poland in September of 1939. And the drashot go from September 1939 through the summer of 1942. So the piece that we're going to be looking at today is one of the first pieces in the book. It's on Parashat Chayei Sarah from 1939. Parashat Chayei Sarah is, I believe, the fifth parsha in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis. It begins with Sarah's death. And so that is really the piece that we're going to be focusing on. This entire commentary is really focusing on one or two psukim, one or two verses in the entire Torah portion of Chayei Sarah. And Chayei Sarah has a lot of different things in it. It begins with Sarah's death, and then it talks about her burial in the cave of Machpelah near Hebron, or in Hebron rather. And then there's an entire section about Abraham sending his servant Eliezer to find a wife for Yitzchak. We're not even going to talk about that part of the parsha today. We're literally going to be focusing only on the first couple of verses that talk about Sarah. And this is a commentary that he wrote about suffering and how we grapple with suffering. And I think it's really important contextually to know, as far as I understand, that this was written, he wrote this particular piece very soon after several of his family members were murdered in a Nazi bombing. And so we can only imagine the upheaval that was beginning and would continue throughout the time that he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and just the pain that he experienced at the loss of his family, and the way that that really affected how he thought about this Torah portion in particular, but also just suffering in general. And there's some really, I think, very interesting theological claims made. And the thing to understand about the book, the Aish Kodesh, is that it's very much steeped in Hasidic spirituality and Hasidic thinking. So it very much talks about faith during the Holocaust, but it is really, really steeped in the richness of his lineages as the scion of a really extinguished and distinguished Hasidic family. So that is important context for when we actually read through the pieces that we're going to read. I want to also say as a disclaimer that I only have the English for you in this moment. I apologize. I would normally love to give the original Hebrew. We're going to be working off of an English translation by J. Hershey Warsh, which was published in 2002. So we're going to be just reading through that together. And at the end, I'm going to open it for Q&A. and some interaction. So I'm also going to be, as I've done in previous weeks, I'm going to stop and I'm going to clarify things as they emerge, but I'm only going to be working off of the English translation because I want to make sure that we are all focusing on the same text, and also because of timing. If we had like 5 hours, we could do a lot of exploration of every nook and cranny, maybe one day, but for time, we're just going to focus on the English piece. So if you would like to download, there is a Dropbox link. Now, one other thing, I do plan to do a different piece next week. However, if we don't finish this piece is so important that we will continue it next week. So we'll see how far we get, and we will take it from there. And I think that it's a really, I believe this is a very rich piece, and I want to leave us ample time for conversation and back and forth and discussion. So I'm going to start reading now, and I'm going to explain along the way. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat as I go. And Julie, if there's anything that comes up that you think is particularly important for a moment, please interrupt me and I will take questions as I go as well, because I really want to make sure that we actually get a chance to unpack this text.
Okay, thanks.
So, okay, this is from November 4th of 1939. Sarah lived to be 100 years and 20 years and 7 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So that's quoting from Genesis 23, verse 1. Rashi explains, the numbers of years are written separately, 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, for a reason. They are set out in this way to tell us that just as a person younger than 20 years of age is legally considered a minor and hence without sin, so Sarah, when she was 100 years old, was also without sin. The verse ends with the words, these were the years of the life of Sarah, because Sarah's years at all these ages were equally virtuous. So that's just an explanation of why the rabbis always want to know whenever anything comes up in the Torah, rabbis always want to know what's going on. It might feel superfluous to say that Sarah lived 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. Those were the life of Sarah. And rabbis also are very interested in the paradox that we call this parasha Chaye Sarah, because Torah portions are generally called by the rabbis after the first significant word in the parsha. So Chaye Sarah is seemingly paradoxical because Chaye Sarah literally means the life of Sarah. And so the rabbis are wondering, we're calling this parsha the life of Sarah. Why are we calling it the life of Sarah when actually the first thing we talk about is her death? So they're just trying to, that's a rabbinic explanation, and Rashi is one of the most famous commentators, lived in medieval France in the 11th and 12th centuries. What is this chapter teaching us? Of all of the great saints and righteous women mentioned in the Torah, none are spoken of as highly as is Sarah. The puzzle becomes even greater when considered in light of what is written of Abraham upon his death. When Abraham, our father, dies, the Torah also says he lived a total of 100 years and 70 years and 5 years, Genesis 25:7. And Rashi there explains that this also was because Abraham lived without sin. And yet at the end of, excuse me, I'm going to turn this page. At the end of this verse, we do not find the words, these were the years of the life of Abraham, which might tell us, as with Sarah, that all the sets of years were considered equal in virtue. In the holy book Ma'or B'Shemesh, we find a quote from Rabbi Menachem Mendel Raimanov, taken from his commentary on the beginning of chapter 6 in Exodus. This concerns a teaching found in the Talmud in Brachot 5a. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, excuse me, I'm going to do the Hebrew, it's a little bit easier for me than the transliteration, said, the Torah uses the words covenant in its description of salt in Leviticus 2:13. This also uses, it also uses the word covenant in its description of the suffering in Deuteronomy 28. in Deuteronomy 28:69, this teaches us that just as the salt purges meat, so does suffering purify a person. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Romanov adds the following. And similarly, just as meat is ruined when overly salted, so can a person be damaged by unbearable suffering. For a person to be properly seasoned by suffering, the suffering must be administered with mercy and properly offset against the person's ability to cope. So I want to stop there before we actually continue. This, I think, is a really key, in my understanding of this text, that piece that he's bringing in there is a really key piece of what's going to happen next. Because the point that's being made here is that, often I think that we tend to, there's that line that some people use that I'm never a fan of, that Hashem never gives you more than you can handle. Right, that somehow Hashem never gives you more than you can handle. And so therefore, like the unspoken assumption there as well, if Hashem doesn't give me more than I can handle, any feelings that I might have about what I'm experiencing, I need to just kind of put aside, right? That's not, that clearly this suffering is happening, I can handle it. And if this is what Hashem wants, then I can handle it. I think here we're getting a very interesting piece that's being brought both from Brachot, from the Talmud, and also from Menachem Mendel of Romanov, which is this idea that suffering that a person experiences can get to a point where it's really hard. That's where he's going to go with this text. He's going to be talking about what happens when you actually experience suffering that is so acute that you really cannot it breaks you. It really just breaks you. It feels like you're hitting this point where you just can't take anymore. And I think it's important to stop here and name that part of what's happening is that Sarah is understood in Jewish tradition, because so what happens, so the Genesis 23:1, where the Parashat Chaye Sarah begins, happens immediately after Akedat Yitzchak, immediately after the near sacrifice of Isaac. Sometimes it's translated in English as the binding of Isaac, the very famous story of Isaac being nearly sacrificed, and then Abraham being stopped by an angel. And one can only imagine, and there's a lot of midrash on this, one can only imagine the way that Sarai is going to react to the fact that her son was nearly killed, and was nearly killed by her own husband at that. I mean, it's hard for us to even really put our minds in that space, right? What does it mean? What does it mean to find out as a human being, as a mother, as a person in the world, that your son was almost sacrificed? So what's happening here is that he's going to get to a point, and we're going to get there as we go on, where he's going to be talking about that just broke her. She couldn't take more. It's almost like the suffering, it just gets so much. It's like a cry out to Hashem. Hashem, I can't take this anymore. This is too much for me. So I'm going to continue reading, but I wanted to just point that out as like a piece that we're going to be experiencing as we go forward. Rashi asks, why does the Torah recount the death of Sarah directly after the account? See, here we go. This is exactly what I was just talking about. After the account of the binding of Isaac. I'm just going to put this down in a better spot. After the account of the binding of Isaac, is the text suggesting some connection between these two events? Rashi answers, when Sarah was told of the binding of Isaac, of how he was prepared for slaughter, of how the knife was laid at his throat, her soul fled and she died. So again, when Sarai is told about this awful thing, about literally going from every piece of it, from how he was prepared for slaughter and how the knife was laid at his throat, her soul fled from her body. She couldn't handle it. She couldn't take it. So Moses, our teacher, the trusted shepherd, deliberately edited the Torah. He placed these two events, the death of Sarah and the binding of Isaac, side by side in the text in order to advocate on our behalf. By doing this, Moses is suggesting that if the anguish is, Moses is suggesting that if the anguish is, God forbid, unbearable, then death can result. He is showing us something important, that if this could happen, even to Sarah, who was of such a stature that the Torah goes to great length to tell us how when she was 100 years old, she was as virtuous as a girl of 20, and when she was 20 years, she was as innocent as a child of 7, that in fact, all her life she was equally virtuous. If she, Sarah, was unable to bear such pain, how much less so can we? The Torah may also be telling us that our mother Sarah, who took the binding of Isaac so much to heart that her soul flew out of her, died for the good of the Jewish people. She died in order to show God she died in order to show God that a Jew should excuse me. She died in order to show God that a Jew should not be expected to suffer unlimited levels of anguish. Even though a person with the mercy of God survives and escapes death, nevertheless, elements of his capability, his mind, and his spirit are forever broken, and as a result of his ordeal, lost to him. In the final analysis, what difference does it make whether all of me or part of me is killed? Perhaps the text itself is answering the question by saying, these were the years of the life of Sarah. One might tend to judge Sarah as having sinned against the remainder of her years, because if she had not taken the binding of Isaac so much to heart, she would have lived longer. However, since this taking to heart was done for the good of the Jewish people, the verse hints that the years Sarah might have lived beyond her 127 years were not wasted, and so she did not really sin against those years. Therefore, let God quickly send us spiritual and physical salvation with revealed kindness. So that's the ending of that commentary. So I think that there's a lot that we can unpack here, and we'll spend the rest of our time together in conversation. There's a lot here. There's an idea that what does it mean to think about the effect that suffering has upon the person? I'm very struck, as I read this yet again, I'm very struck by the fact that the Piaseczna is noting that when we go through whatever ordeals we are going through in our lives, no matter how big or small, every single one of us is experiencing different ordeals and different challenges, and we can never really know the inner life of another person. But there's something really striking and incredible in the idea that when we go through those experiences, they do leave, this is my understanding, they do leave an indelible mark on the neshama of the person. They really do leave an indelible mark on our souls and on our spirits and in our life stories. That there's something that we lose that we don't ever get again in the same way. And that, what does it mean to be able to, if a person believes, and this is, I think, one of the key ideas in traditional Jewish understanding of how the Torah works, and particularly in this text. If you believe that everything in the Torah, everything in the Holy Torah is very much intentionally written, nothing is superfluous, nothing is redundant. And there's an idea that there's nothing earlier or later in Torah, but yet there's also deliberate. It's interesting that he notes that when Moses edited the Torah, Moses deliberately put or juxtaposed perhaps the binding of Isaac and Sarah's death to teach us a really important lesson about suffering. There's always something eternal that we can get from the Torah text every year. And I would add, and this is my understanding, I would add to that also that wherever we are in our lives at any given time affects how we read the text, whether that's the sacred text of the Torah, or whether, frankly, that's any text that we're reading. But however, wherever we are in our life stage, or whatever's going on for us internally and externally, certainly does affect how we understand what we're reading. I think that there's something very striking and moving about this notion of the Piaseczna asking for relief from the suffering that is being experienced, not only by him internally as a human being who's lost his relatives, but also by his entire community and by the Jewish people. And this is one of the earlier texts in Aish Kodesh. And next week, God willing, we're going to read the last text in Aish Kodesh, which is one of the most heartbreaking texts, but I also find it incredibly moving because it's so real. It's really real. And that's the final thing I really want to comment on before we open this up, is that something that I so deeply appreciate about the Piaseczna and how he writes this sefer, this book in particular, is that he does not shy away from the rawness and the realness of what's going on for his people. That he doesn't shy away from what's going on for himself either in various ways. I mean, nothing is brought in this text about his family, of course. We don't hear anything about that. The reason that I understand this to have been written so soon after is because when you read chronologies of his life, you do learn that in 1939, and I believe it was September and October, I believe it was around Sukkot actually of 1939, he lost many of his relatives in a bombing. And so this was very soon after that. Parashat Chayei Sarah, as I said, is the 5th parsha of the year. So we have just left the Chagim and we are just getting back into the normal Torah cycle at that point. And so I, based on my limited understanding of his life, can't help but imagine that he was thinking about his own pain as he was writing this. So I'm going to stop there, and if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will take them from there.
And if you could direct the chat to me, Julie, My Jewish Learning, and I will read them out loud.
Questions or comments or reflections. I'm really curious to hear what people think of this, if there's anything that really resonated for you, really jumped out, so this is the space, the floor is very open.
Ziona says, I don't have a question, I'm just very moved by this teaching. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if it's someone's preference to speak, just let us know and we can, that's also an option. Rachel has a question. I know that Hasidism focuses on joy. What is the understanding of how suffering is connected to joy?
That's a really excellent question, and I'm going to do my best on one foot, although I would like to make the disclaimer that this is based on my limited learning at this point, and I'm continuing to learn and grow, so I don't know that this is the most complete answer, but it is the answer that I'm able to give at this point, and I'm really grateful for the question. I think that in general, a lot of Hasidut, a lot of Hasidic literature and commentary understands that suffering and joy are both parts of the spiritual life, and actually that both of them are really needed, right? That part of what it means to live a holistic spiritual life is that we are human beings with a spectrum of emotional experiences, and that all of those emotional experiences matter, and that sometimes it's easier when we're feeling a lot of joy and celebration, it can be easier to want to be close to God, to want to be engaged in Jewish community. And also on the flip side, when we're in a lot of pain, sometimes we want to come closer and sometimes we really want to move as far away as we can. So I think that there is a general understanding that human beings are emotionally complicated and complex, and that we need both and to have a really complete and well-rounded sense of self. In terms of the direct connection between suffering and joy, there's a lot of theology around suffering and how, what is the suffering supposed to mean to us, and is it redemptive for us, and all of those things. And one of the pieces that's coming to me actually as I'm thinking about this, so the Piaseczna, I don't remember off the top of my head what year, but I believe it also is in Aish Kodesh and Bashalach, and Parshat Bashalach, which is in the book of Exodus. It's midway through the book of Exodus, Sefer Shmot. And in that Torah portion, we have the song at the sea, Shirat Hayam. So the song at the sea is, one of our most joyous moments. We are about to cross over the Reed Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, and there's a comment in there that we had a cloud that, was with us. And in that text, and I'm doing this like off the top of my head, so like I would want to actually read it over again to give you the most thorough answer. But there's an idea that what we experience in our lives, we make meaning of for ourselves, that we don't actually have the ability to determine the meaning of somebody else's suffering for them. It reminds me, and this is my interpretation of that paraphrasing of the Piaseczna, it reminds me of the idea, again, of God doesn't give you more than you can handle. Well, we don't actually have we as human beings, we actually can't say what another person can and cannot handle. I think it's really easy. We want to do that because we want to, order the chaos around us. We want to exercise some kind of control. We can't actually do that though. And I think that there's an understanding and a recognition that ultimately at the end of the day, every single person, whatever we learn from whatever we experience in terms of our own suffering, whatever lessons we take from those, whatever moments of redemption, as the Hasidic masters might put it, we take from those, that is something between us and Hashem. That's not something that any other human being can determine for us. So I think that the answer is, to the joy and the suffering, how are those connected? I think that both are understood as part of a full and fully rounded spiritual life. And I think also there's a recognition that so much of this is deeply individual to the person.
Okay, question, can you, where is suicide in this teaching?
I can't answer that because I don't want to wager where he would hold on suicide. So I think it's an incredibly important question, and the reason that I'm not really hesitating to give a solid answer to it is because I simply don't know. I'm really, truly not sure what he would say about that. And I don't want to make an assumption based on my understanding of the teaching, what he would say on that. Though I do think it is very important to name that we are getting a more sophisticated understanding of suicidality and suicide, and that there are contemporary thinkers in the Jewish world who certainly have written on this. There's an organization called Elijah's Journey, which I would really recommend if anybody is interested in exploring this further. Elijah's Journey is a very good place to check. They have a lot of information that talks about Judaism and mental health and all of those really important topics that we need to be spending a lot more time thinking about and writing about and being compassionate and empathetic about. And I don't want to answer for the Piaseczna because I simply just do not know what he would have said.
A couple people wanted to ask questions verbally. So Andrew, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I've been pondering and thinking these passages and then the story for many, many, many years throughout my life. And I work off the premise that the sacrifice of Isaac was a profound misunderstanding by Abraham. And that God had to intervene to say, no, this is not the faith. This is not what I expect from a parent or from yourself to kill a child. But that the story about Sarah I found so important, because in a lot of religions, having the woman's point of view and the woman's experience is not always delineated or mapped out effectively. And I think this story speaks to me about Sarah. I'm not sure I want to use the word judging, but as an additional kind of rebuke of Abraham, that of a mother said, how dare you even have considered misunderstanding your faith to kill my son? And we live in a world where there's a lot of abusive parents who do terrible things to their children, and husband and wife relationships get very twisted and toxic. And I think this is a very beautiful kind of understanding that Rabbi Tuchman is providing, and I want to say thank you. But I feel that there's much more more sophisticated, I don't want to say darker, but deeper disposition that is going on. So that's sort of my thoughts.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing all of that. I really appreciate you sharing. And yes, I would agree that this is a very complicated and complex story. I think that there is something really beautiful about Sarah's viewpoint being really lifted up here, as you said, that is very important. I think also the cry, I think that that's really what the Piaseczna is getting at, that Sarah, Imenu, Sarah, our mother, cries out, like, what were you thinking? How dare you? I can't take the suffering. And really going through and explaining how she was told all about the preparation for slaughter and preparing the knife and all of that. And I think also we can understand that as a cry from so many people, as you noted. So many people in this world are in abusive relationships, familially or otherwise, but that is very real, and that there's a lot of pain and anguish in the world today, and there always has been, and we are hearing about it and seeing it and experiencing it much more in this time for so many reasons. So thank you very much for sharing that. I would love to take a few more questions in the last couple of minutes we have, or hear a few more thoughts.
Okay, great. So Ziona, it's your turn, and then I'll go through the chats and ask a few of the questions there.
Thank you. Rabbi, thank you for really this wonderful teaching. As I'm listening to you comment about, you can hear me, correct?
I can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. As I hear you comment about things, the aphorisms and the cliches, you're only given what you can handle and all of that. I'm thinking about much of the material that's being written now about grieving and how to go through grieving and honor grieving, and even more importantly, how to encounter the grieving person. And, without the aphorisms, without those comments that are meant well, but really are offered because one doesn't know how to interface or to be with or to truly console a grieving person, if that's even what they want. So I'm wondering if you can kind of comment on that, help me to make a connection, like a more tangible connection between this teaching, which is just so resonating with me, and the practice of properly being with a grieving person or with your own grieving in a way that is really compassionate and is not more of the self-defense, like, I don't know what to say to you and this makes me so uncomfortable, but this is what we say, so I'm going to say that to you and then I got to leave. It's a awkward question, but perhaps you understand what I'm asking.
I believe I do, and forgive me if I, and please feel free to jump in if I am not hearing you correctly. What I heard the question, Ziona, and it's a beautiful one, is what is the connection between this teaching and really active presence with somebody who's grieving or with oneself in a grieving process, rather than jumping to the cliches of all of the cliches that I'm sure all of us know and have heard at least once or twice in our lives, and I can speak for myself, has never left me feeling anything other but terrible inside when I hear them. So I think that there are a couple of pieces. the Piaseczna, and I know this from other books and other things that I've learned, he is very much about doing inner work on oneself. That is a core practice for him. And he has several svarim, several books that talk about spiritual life and cultivating a spiritual consciousness. One of them is called B'nai Machshava Tova, which literally means the conscious community, and it's all about doing this very deep inner work within a group setting where we are accountable to other people, but it's a very small, intimate setting so that you can actually do the work that you need to do. I think that there is a tremendous connection, and I think it's a beautiful question. I think that so many of us are so uncomfortable with the unknown. We don't know what to do with it. So because we don't know how to sit with the discomfort, we don't know how to be with those feelings as they're arising, we jump to that defensive posture. Or because of our own fear that we haven't processed, because of what we don't understand, we automatically jump to that self-defense posture because it's a way for us to say, well, if I do this and that and the other, it's not going to happen to me. Whatever you are experiencing, God willing, I will not experience, and then I can go on my merry way. I think that what's happening in this teaching, I think that one of the things as I understand it, that I would encourage based on how I read this, is that part of it is saying, like, listen, I know that suffering can really hurt, like can really break a person. It's hard. You know, there's this idea you're supposed to bounce back from, like, now I'm going to be talking in more modern language, you know, this whole idea that we have of we're supposed to bounce back, and, you know, we'll go through this linear grieving process that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and anybody who's ever grieved, I don't think it actually really works that way. At least in my own life experience, I don't feel like a lot of it is linear. And then you'll somehow get through it and be totally unchanged by it, and we'll all go back to how it was before. And I think that for all of us now with COVID, we understand on an intuitive level that that's just not the case, that even when we go back, or some of us have gone back, some of us are in process of going back, you know, everything is different for every individual. Whatever new paradigm we shift into, we will be forever changed by the experiences that we've had this year. And so too, I think grief does that to a person. And I believe the Piaseczna is really asking and even commanding us to be able to sit with it in a very profound way, not to run away from it. There's this idea that the Piaseczna teaches that every feeling we have is a key to our soul, because every feeling we have is telling us something important. Feelings and actions in response to feelings are separate questions, right? How we react to a feeling we have is a separate question from the fact that we have a feeling. And that feeling tells us something very important about what's going on for us internally. And he talks about how people want to avoid those feelings by any number of things, and that it doesn't work because eventually they're going to come back. We can't stuff them down forever. Eventually, these things are going to come back. We need to deal with them productively. And I think that the way we deal with them productively is to really allow them to be there, to really sit with them, and to allow ourselves to experience them, you know, and to do so in a way that allows us to be able to move forward. I don't love the word move on, to move forward, but that allows for presence. I mean, one of the things that I keep thinking about is that one of the things that we do as Jews for Shiva is that when you traditionally make a Shiva call, you only spoke when spoken to. That when you make a Shiva call, it's about you comforting the mourner. It's not about you being entertained or schmoozing or catching up with your friends that you might see at the Shiva house. That sounds like a very hard thing to even imagine that you would want to schmooze at a Shiva house, but like, those are not the reasons we do this. We do this because we physically hold a container for the grief by physically sitting with the mourners and being present for them, by simply showing up and by holding space. And I think that that's really what we are being encouraged to do, is to speak a lot less and hold a lot more space by showing up and offering of ourselves, even as just a listener or a sounding board.
Okay, do we have time for one more question?
Let's take one more, yeah.
Okay, so Cornelia asks, and sorry to everyone that we didn't have time to get to everyone's question, The question that he asks in the second to last paragraph, what difference does it make whether all of me or part of me is killed, is so complex and heartbreaking. It feels deeply theological, and I'm interested in how or if he untangles that.
Yeah, I have the same question. I completely agree. It is an incredibly complicated theological question. What difference does it make if only part of me or all of me is killed, right? Like, what difference, like, the way that I think about that personally, right? Because I don't know that, and I can investigate this actually and ask a few of my teachers. I don't know if he actually really unpacks that fully, but it's such a complicated question. Because I would imagine, I mean, for any of us, if we put ourselves in the position of whatever grief we've experienced in our own life, whatever suffering we've experienced in our own life, sometimes it can feel like it takes us over entirely. That's how I understand the all of me, right? That's what I understand about the inward sense of just that sense of feeling completely dead or empty inside versus part. I mean, it's hard to imagine part of me feeling it, but also maybe perhaps as I'm saying this, I'm thinking maybe he's also talking about how there's always a dull ache, right? There's always a dull ache of the grief that we have experienced. I mean, in my own family, there was a particular tragedy that happened a few years before I was born, and I know that those who lived through that tragic experience carry the wound every day. They've moved on, they've built really great lives for themselves, and are, you know, living in really extraordinary ways. But that tragedy that they experience, which I feel like I also kind of experienced in a secondary way because I grew up hearing about it and I grew up knowing the impact, that is something that is there. There's always that wound. So I wonder if perhaps the question is carrying it in a really frontal way, like it's at the front of my consciousness all the time, versus that dull ache that a lot of us carry even when we resume our lives or resume some kind of normalcy.